Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this neighborhood lecture. This is the last of our 2021 season. My name is Richard Carlson. I'm the director of the Earth and Planets Laboratory of the Carnegie Institution for Science. Tonight's presentation is about what makes a planet habitable. This question has likely occupied human thought for quite some time, but has taken on additional significance with the discovery that essentially every star you see in the night sky has planets orbiting it. The discovery of the first of these exoplanets occurred almost 30 years ago. Since then, thousands of exoplanets have been discovered, and the field has moved on to characterizing them by their size, their mass, and their orbital relationship with their star and neighboring planets. At the cutting edge of exoplanet observations is characterization of the composition of their atmospheres. Earth's atmosphere carries many signs of the existence of life on Earth, most obviously in the abundance of the very reactive gas oxygen. One need only look at our nearest planetary neighbor, Venus, to see that conditions on Earth's surface could have been very much different. The atmospheric pressure at the surface of Venus is about 95 times that of Earth. The atmosphere is predominantly carbon dioxide, and the surface temperature is about 900 degrees Fahrenheit. Only since the advent of plate tectonic theory in the 1960s have we realized that the dynamics of Earth's interior exert substantial influence over Earth's surface. Although it's a very slow conversation occurring over millions of years, this two-way exchange between the surface and the interior has played a huge role in moderating the conditions of Earth's surface over billions of years, providing a stable environment that allowed life to develop and sustained it through the slow evolutionary steps that eventually led to complex life like us. Tonight's speaker, Dr. Anat Shahar, is leading a large multidisciplinary project to try to figure out which characteristics of a planet are most important to make it habitable. Is plate tectonics essential, or is distance from the central star the deciding factor? Is a planetary magnetic field necessary to preserve the atmosphere and protect the surface from cosmic irradiation? So many factors feed into establishing surface conditions on a planet that this question can only be addressed by combining expertise across a wide range of disciplines. Dr. Shahar has established and is leading such a diverse team, as we will hear in tonight's presentation. She obtained her PhD in geochemistry from UCLA in 2008 and joined us here at Carnegie immediately afterwards, first as a postdoc and then as a staff scientist. Her research focus started in the deepest portions of a planet, looking at how metallic cores form. She addressed this question by developing novel geochemical techniques that are sensitive to the separation of iron metal from silicate at very high pressures and temperatures. In the project she'll discuss tonight, she brings this expertise with solid planet dynamics to the question of the role of the solid planet in determining conditions at the planet's surface. Her work has been recognized with many awards, including the Clark Medal of the Geochemical Society, the MSA Award of the Mineralogical Society of America, and she was most recently selected to give the Reginald Daly Lecture at the upcoming meeting of the American Geophysical Union. Tonight, she'll be discussing her wide-ranging project whose goal is to understand what makes a planet habitable. If you have questions during and after the talk, please type them into the Q&A session at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Anat, I'll pass it over to you now.
Thanks very much, Rick. Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm super excited to talk to you all tonight about what makes a planet habitable. You'll see by the end of the talk that the answer to this question is very much, it depends who you ask. As scientists, we tend to see scientific questions through the lens of our own expertise, but it is this particular question that has forced us to start to see science through a more multidisciplinary lens. What I'd like to do in this talk is take you through how we're studying this question, but unlike most talks with a clear introduction and a clear conclusion, this one will end with many more questions than answers. However, I hope that after hearing this talk, when you look up at the night sky, you have a new appreciation for how we as planetary scientists, astronomers, and Earth scientists approach this very complicated but seemingly simple question of what makes a planet habitable. So the best place to start is with the incredible discovery of thousands of exoplanets in our galaxy. An exoplanet is simply a planet that is not in our solar system. We currently know of 8 planets in our solar system. When I was growing up, there were 9 because of Pluto. And everything we've understood about planetary formation and evolution was based on these 8 or 9 planets. However, over the last 3 decades, thousands of planets have been discovered, and that has completely changed the way we as scientists understand planetary formation and evolution. This is an animation of a sample of the exoplanets found from the Kepler mission and shows how different these exoplanetary systems are. The dashed lines are the planets in our solar system, just for reference, and the orbit of the exoplanetary systems are scaled to the same size. The color represents the estimated temperature of the surface of the planet, and the star for each system is in the center. What you see is that no two systems are the same. There are large planets orbiting closer than smaller planets. There are systems with lots of planets orbiting extremely close to one another. There are ones that just have a few small planets. The solar system architecture is unbelievably diverse. And of course, the most obvious question we have is, can any of these planets host life? So how do we understand where to look for life within the galaxy? As our technology gets better and better, there will come a time where someone will decide to look for life on an exoplanet, a planet outside of our solar system. But how will they know where to look? Which exoplanets are most likely to harbor life? What type of planet can not only originate life, but sustain it? It's not only important to be able to have life begin, but a planet needs to also be able to sustain the life. And what are the characteristics of such a planet? And really, at the most basic level, what does habitable even mean? Well, this is where it gets really interesting, because it turns out that the word habitable has very different definitions depending on who you ask. I'll argue to you tonight that habitability depends on chemistry and physics as much as, if not more, than biology. From our point of view, whether life originates on a planet and is sustained is a scientific question that is based in planetary science and not just in biology. Okay, so here we see two planets. On the left, we have Earth, a planet we know very well, and the only planet in the universe that we know has life for sure. On the right is an artist's rendition of a planet called Trappist 1e. It is a planet that orbits the star Trappist 1 that is 40 light years away. So it would take like 40 years to get there. This solar system has 7 planets in it, in which 3, including Trappist 1e, have been reported to be in the habitable zone. So again, we have one planet that's habitable and one that's in the habitable zone. But what do these words mean? A planet's habitability, or ability to harbor life, results from a very complex network of interactions between the planet, the system it's part of, and the star that it orbits. The standard definition for a habitable planet is one that can sustain life for a significant period of time. So if we start with the Earth, we can ask ourselves, why is the Earth habitable? What factors are responsible for allowing life on Earth to originate and to be sustained? Well, the first is liquid water. Water is considered essential for many reasons that really have a lot to do with its shape. You see, it has this asymmetric shape with a positive side and a negative side. It's a polar molecule. This asymmetry is actually quite crucial to how water bonds with other molecules and itself, including biological molecules that also have an asymmetry. This allows water to be called the universal solvent. What that means is that it can dissolve a variety of molecules by being able to transport water substances into and out of cells. So into the cells, it takes nutrients like oxygen or other nutrients that the cell might need. But then to stay alive, it also shuttles out the toxic substances, such as waste products. Life on Earth has been found in places where there's no sun, but never where there's no liquid water. So you might know that NASA has had a follow the water mantra for quite some time. The second is a magnetic field. A magnetic field deflects dangerous ionizing particles from the solar wind and cosmic rays. It's thought that Earth's strong magnetic field also played a really important role in protecting the atmosphere from being stripped away by the solar wind, keeping the surface wet and therefore habitable. The magnetic field is generated deep in a planet's interior from convection inside of a molten iron core. The composition of this core is actually crucial to determining if the magnetic field gets generated. And the third key ingredient, as Rick mentioned in his introduction, is plate tectonics, or at least some way to recycle nutrients and replenish the surface with new material. Plate tectonics is what modulates our atmosphere and our climate at the longest timescales. The carbon cycle modulates the climate by consuming CO2 from the atmosphere, cooling the climate a little bit, causing weathering to decrease slightly, therefore increasing the CO2 a little bit and warming the climate slightly. This is a feedback loop that would not be possible without plate tectonics. The important thing for life is that a planet have a landmass that exchanges and circulates material, recycling nutrients, as well as other volatiles such as water, for example, or carbon dioxide. So again, if you ask an Earth scientist like me what habitability means, I'll tell you that I'm not 100% sure. But I know that on Earth, these three key ingredients definitely make our planet more of a habitable environment. So if an exoplanet was found that had water, a magnetic field, and plate tectonics, it would be a great bet that it would have life as well. It's kind of hard to find though. So what determines if a planet has these key ingredients? It turns out that all of these factors are governed by the planet itself. The size, the temperature, the pressure, the composition of the planet itself. That's why I said in the beginning that habitability is more of a chemical and physical process and less of a biological one, because the planet itself needs to be ready to originate and sustain the life before biology can begin to form. And the path a planet takes to have that current composition, pressure, temperature, and size is actually a complicated several billion year history that we need to understand. If we go through this timeline a bit, it begins with the formation of a star starting to burn and ends when a solar system is fully formed. Within the first 10 million years or so, the massive gas-rich disk that surrounds the star is gone. The giant planets have formed. And in the next 10 to 100 million years, the terrestrial planets form. Giant impacts occur, planets differentiate, they separate into different layers. And today you're left with a solar system, in our case, that has 8 planets. But we can't watch a solar system evolve over billions of years. So we need to be clever and look at remnants of the early solar system, or observe other systems and see different stages in their evolution. So is it a coincidence that Earth had a certain path that led it to be habitable? Or is it a common series of events that occur for lots of planets, and therefore something that we can look for in other solar systems? For example, there are a few key events that occurred in Earth's history that changed its evolution to be the planet that we know today. For example, the giant impact, core formation, and something called giant planet migration. If we start with giant planet migration, it turns out that planets move. They move, and when they move around the key ingredients that life needs, like carbon, water, oxygen. So what I mean by this is that where the planets are in the solar system today is not necessarily where they started out, and how they got there and what material they soaked up when they were forming can change. So for example, you can run simulations such as this one that show how planets move early in solar system history. So this simulation shows Jupiter forming at 3.5 AU, migrating inwards, and then bouncing back out when it's captured with Saturn in resonance. What happens when, I'll play it again, what happens when it does that, right? When it moves in, and then you see it bouncing back out. You see all those bodies that were in that system have scattered everywhere. And that is a lot of material that is now no longer available for planets to form. Later in Earth history, one of the most dramatic and important processes every planet goes through of a certain size is called differentiation, which means that it separates into layers based on the density of the material inside the planet. During this process, most of a planet's iron will sink to the center to form an iron alloy core that's then responsible for the generation of a magnetic field that's so important for life. If this process occurs in a different way, with a different composition, a different temperature, the dynamo might never start. Further, the elements that get sequestered inside the core are some of the same elements that are needed for life, like carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, sulfur, and nitrogen. So it's this composition of the core is dependent on the size of the body, the heat, the initial composition of the planet itself. And we never know, in other solar systems, the composition of the planets might be different than the composition of our Earth. So one way to study this is to conduct experiments in the lab that simulate this process at a range of pressures, temperatures, and compositions. So for example, here is one experiment that started out as a powder. And when it was brought up to high pressure and temperature, it melted, and you can see the metal segregated into the center and the rocky outer portion segregated to the outside. This experiment is about 4 times smaller than the size of a penny, but it's actually one of the largest experiments that we can do. As the temperature and pressure increase as a planet gets larger and larger, the sample sizes get smaller and smaller. But we have techniques that allow us to mimic what these planetary interiors look like, even at the highest pressure and temperature conditions. We can use tools such as a hydraulic press that compresses samples between anvils. We can use diamonds and put samples in between 2 diamonds and then squeeze them together to create high pressure. We can use a gas gun that launches a projectile to the sample to shock it. And at the highest pressures, we can use something called the Z machine, which uses electricity to create radiation and high magnetic pressure that shocks materials to very high pressures. Each shot of the Z machine carries more than 1,000 times the electricity of a lightning bolt. We also have the moon-forming giant impact, which shown here in a video by Miki Nakajima, an ex-Carnegie postdoc and now assistant professor at the University of Rochester. This process completely changed the Earth's trajectory. This is when 2 bodies hit each other at high speeds, and depending on the size of the impact and the impactor, the resulting planets will have very, very different paths. So here, Earth gets a moon from this giant impact. The interesting thing is that we think now that impacts were quite ubiquitous in the early solar system, and therefore could have had a pretty large effect on planetary evolution. There are some scientists that think that the moon is essential for habitability because it can stabilize the climate by stabilizing the tilt of the planet. But others that disagree, so it's still an open question. However, there's no question that a giant impact can greatly affect the trajectory of a planet. Okay, so it's going to be a long time until we can detect plate tectonics, for example, on the surface of a planet. So from a geological standpoint, what we need to do is understand the evolution of the terrestrial planet and how different chemical and physical processes it undergoes then affect the trajectory of the planet to either be one that has all the necessary ingredients for life or one that's dead. So for example, on the left here, you see a planet with plate tectonics that stabilizes the surface climate and cools the interior by letting out heat. It therefore generates a magnetic field that then shields the surface from the water loss and from any harmful radiation. On the other hand, we have a planet with a stagnant lid. It means it doesn't move, which inhibits the magnetic field generation because it doesn't let out any heat, allowing water loss to space and rendering the surface just too hot and dry for any life. So if we go back to our original question, what does habitable mean? We've seen now that it means from an Earth-centric point of view that we need 3 key ingredients, right? But what does it mean from an astronomical point of view, where we have much less information and need to use more indirect evidence to define habitability and the habitable zone, but we have lots more statistics. So what do we know about exoplanets? Well, we usually know their orbital periods, the amount of time it takes for the planet to orbit around the central star. We also usually have an idea of the temperature of the star based on the wavelength at which the star emits light. So if we assume a certain amount of light that's reflected off the planet from the star, we can estimate a temperature at the surface of the planet. This is an oversimplification, but based on that temperature, we can determine whether liquid water is stable on the surface of the planet. So we're going back to liquid water as a habitable feature. However, in this case, we're looking at it based on the temperature of the surface of the planet and not actually being able to detect it. This is a diagram showing the habitable zone boundaries around stars and how the boundaries are affected by the temperature of the star. This plot includes Venus, Earth, Mars within our own solar system, and you can see the Trappist-1 planets here. The optimistic habitable zone is an empirical value. It's defined based on when liquid surface water last could have existed on Venus and on Mars. The more conservative limits are based on the same, but then modeling a planet with an Earth-like atmosphere. So you can see that even getting these habitable zone curves requires some significant work. So again, the habitable zone is a region around a star where liquid surface water can exist. And it's currently defined for our own solar system. So if we go back to this animation from the very beginning of the talk, we can see that all the blue colored planets are the ones that would be in the habitable zone if we're just referring to temperature of the surface and the ability to host liquid water. What else do we know about exoplanets? Well, we can use the bulk density of the planet to help decide if it's habitable. The density of the planet tells us if it's rocky, metallic, gaseous, in between. We assume for the time being that habitable planets should be rocky, like the Earth. And in order to get the density, we need the mass and the radius, because density is mass over volume. Planet masses are measured primarily through what's called the radial velocity or Doppler wobble technique, where you observe small changes in the star's orbit due to the interaction it has with orbiting planets by seeing changes in the star's spectral lines as it moves towards you and away from you. So let me show you what that looks like. So you know that gravity holds a planet in place in orbit around a star, but gravity also works both ways. As the planets sweep around in their orbits, they also tug on their parent stars, causing the stars to wobble. This is how the first exoplanets around sun-like stars were detected. And it's actually a technique that was pioneered by one of Carnegie's scientists, Paul Butler. Now Carnegie scientists use the Magellan 2 telescope to make these measurements. Hot Jupiters, which are a type of planet, giant planet that orbit very close to their star, so their orbits are just a few days, have RV signals, radial velocity signals, in the tens to hundreds of meters per second. Whereas if you were to look at Earth and try to detect Earth this way, Earth has a signal of 9 centimeters per second on the sun. Okay, so that was mass. What about radius? Exoplanet radii are measured through the transit technique, which was used by the Kepler space mission to find thousands of new planets. Here, the planet passes between you and the host star. And as it passes in front of the star, it blocks out a little bit of the light from the star. So the measurement, that's my dog. The measurement here is the ratio of the planet's radius to the star's radius. For reference, hot Jupiters typically have transit depths around 1%, whereas Earth around the sun has a transit depth of less than 0.01%. So you can see here, as the planets go in front of the star, some of the light gets blocked out. These are measurements that can be made from the ground for medium and large planets, but are better made from space with missions like Kepler and its successor, the Transiting Exoplanet Survey Satellite, TESS, which was launched in the spring of 2018. Unlike Kepler, TESS searches for planets around stars across the entire sky and is focused on finding the closest systems, which are perfect for then more detailed characterization. Okay, so once you have the radius and the mass, you can plot them on plots like this, where you also have the density of iron, of rock, and of water. The more habitable planets are the ones that fall closer to this rocky line. While there are some assumptions in a plot like this to make it difficult to know for sure that these planets are rocky or terrestrial, this is a great general estimate for the density of planets. And lastly, the atmospheric composition is used to assess habitability. The main way to determine an exoplanet's atmospheric composition is also through planetary transit. As the planet transits around the star, some of the star's light filters through the upper atmosphere of the planet, which contains different molecules depending on the gases in the atmosphere, and each one has their own spectral fingerprint, which we can then distinguish. So this gives us a direct constraint on atmospheric composition. So let me show you how that works. So as the planet transits in front, you can see different wavelengths are absorbed by different gases. And when you look at the spectrum, at the absorption spectrum, you can see, for example, that water vapor shows up here, carbon dioxide and methane as an example. And based on this composition, models can then be built that can suggest whether or not that mixture of gases is a biosignature. A biosignature is something that suggests the evidence of life. The problem with atmospheric detections is that we need to worry a lot about potential false positives. So for example, this cartoon summarizes the atmospheric mechanisms by which oxygen could form abiotically, so not by life, at high abundances in planetary atmospheres. The extreme panel here to the left is Earth, and the 4 panels to the right show 4 different mechanisms for creating abiotic oxygen. The circled molecules, if detected, would reveal a false positive mechanism. A lack of detection of the forbidden molecules would also help to reveal the false positive mechanism. So for example, if we take this panel, if the presence of CO2 and CO and the absence of methane would be a strong indicator of a photochemical source of oxygen from photolysis in this atmosphere, as opposed to for life. Okay, so if we go back to our timeline of planet formation in general, this time with both astronomical and geological observations, we see that the problem is actually quite complicated. We have ideas of what we need for life on Earth, but we're looking for them or indirect signatures of them on exoplanets that are really far away. What we need is to be able to find a signature or a proxy for life that we can observe, but we also need to be able to understand that observation. We need to make sure that the signature we find is really a biological process and not one that can be formed by an abiotic process in the billions of years of planet formation and evolution that you can see in this timeline. The 6 different variables I just took you through are either too specific to see on exoplanets, like liquid water on the surface or plate tectonics, or too broad that we don't have enough information to really say whether the temperature or density, for example, is perfect for habitability. So it turns out you can't really do this alone. You can't do this as an earth scientist, and you can't do it as an astronomer. So instead of looking at habitability from above, the way astronomers do, or from below, like a geologist would, what we want to do is we want to look at it from all different angles. What this means is that we want to find a proxy for life that we can understand experimentally, theoretically, and observationally. And in order to do that, we need to work across many disciplines and learn to speak the same language, which is much harder than it sounds. And it turns out that the proxy for life that is the best is the atmosphere of the exoplanet. What I explained to you before is how atmospheres are signatures of what's occurring on the planet today. But atmospheres are actually much more than that. They are windows into the surface, interior, origins, and therefore the habitability of a planet. The composition of the atmosphere is affected by chemical interactions, not only between the atmosphere and the surface, but also the subsurface of a planet. This is the boundary that rarely gets crossed. This is that astronomy earth science divide that is so crucial to understanding whether or not a gas in the atmosphere is a biosignature or a false detection. The entire timeline of planetary formation can be seen in the atmosphere of a planet if we can understand it. So as Rick mentioned in his introduction, we recently proposed a new research direction to the Sloan Foundation to look at all the processes through time that could have resulted in the atmospheric gases observed. And what we want to do is explain what these observations mean so that in the future, when we find different gases in exoplanet atmospheres, we can understand what it means. So what we want to do is start with a general framework, build a foundation of what to expect, and then make predictions so that a more holistic framework is developed and then tested. Our new Sloan-funded project is called Aether, Atmospheric, Empirical, Theoretical, and Experimental Research, named after the Greek primordial god of light and the blue heavens. Aether is a research project across many disciplines and expertise. It's aimed at understanding which planets are most likely to host life. Again, we're going to do this by conducting experiments, theory, and observations that will enable us and others to tell the difference between a biotic signature or an abiotic signature, one that's produced by a physical or chemical process. Aether is also an interdisciplinary and international team of scientists. The science we want to do is really exciting, but it's much more, but the team is much more than the sum of its parts. It's a team of scientists from around the globe working together to tackle a common problem. We're a group of scientists that have never worked together, but that have very similar scientific goals, but with very different scientific methods. The top 6 people here are the ones that we'll have at the Q&A at the end of this talk, but more on that later. So what is it that we want to do? We see success not necessarily as finding life on another planet, though of course we would love to do that, but being able to distinguish between probable biotic and abiotic signatures. We want to train the next generation of scientists to be leaders in this very multidisciplinary field. And we want to lead the field with our observations, experiments, and modeling. We have some basic questions that we would like to answer. What controls a planet's atmospheric composition and evolution? What is the abiotic composition of the atmosphere of the most common type of planet? How sensitive is atmospheric chemistry to interior chemistry? How does the composition of a planet influence its capacity to harbor life? What percentage of small planets even have atmospheres? And what is the range of planetary atmospheric compositions? The first 2 examples are focused on the simplest atmosphere we can imagine, the most basic and probable abiotic primary atmosphere. We want to understand the starting point for when a planet with a hydrogen-rich atmosphere that's always present when stars form is present, and then follow that hydrogen as it dissolves into a solid planet, escapes into space, sticks around for millions of years, etc. So this plot shows a family tree, if you will, of rocky planets of about 1 to 4 Earth radii. The initial condition of a planet here can lead to 2 different paths. The first leads to the most typical planet found so far in the galaxy that we actually don't have in our own solar system, called the sub-Neptune. And it has a very thick hydrogen atmosphere. The other side leads to a more Earth-like planet that might retain its primary atmosphere or might not because of its smaller size. What we want to understand is the evolution of that atmosphere for these 2 types of planets and what causes one to move in one direction versus the other. And this is how we're going to get a baseline from which to start our framework. Further, the hydrogen doesn't just stay outside the planet in a gas form. It gets soaked into the rocky portion of the planet. At this time in a planet's history, the rock, the mantle, is actually a magma ocean. It is a molten silicate rock, and it can soak up a lot of that hydrogen and a lot of other volatile elements as well. And some of that can even go into the metallic core of a planet. So understanding how the hydrogen moves from the atmosphere into the silicate, into the mantle, into the core is crucial to understanding not only the evolution of the atmosphere, but also the evolution of the planet and the evolution of its composition. The next 2 questions are more focused on the interior atmosphere exchange, so a bit later in the planet's history. This part focuses on the different processes that could occur during the evolution of the abiotic rocky planet. The goal is to understand how each of these different processes could affect the atmospheric composition of the planet. So if we start in this pie here and we work our way counterclockwise, what we see here is that we're interested in how volatiles, so how gases, move between the atmosphere and the molten silicate rock. We're interested in how atmospheric escape occurs from, how much atmospheric escape occurs from the solar flux, how subduction and volcanic activity influence the water cycle, how impacts like the giant impact, but smaller impacts as well, affect the atmosphere, and then putting that all together to see what happens if these processes occur when there are oceans present on the surface of a planet. Most of these tasks are really aimed at how sensitive the atmospheric chemistry is to the interior chemistry, and how changing the composition of that interior chemistry can influence these processes as well. As an example of how composition can affect the trajectory of a planet, here you see artists' rendition of two stars, Kepler-102 and Kepler-407. Kepler-102 is slightly less luminous than the sun and has 5 known planets. Kepler-407 is a star almost identical in mass to the sun and hosts at least 2 planets. Astronomers, including Johanna Teske, who will be on our panel in a little bit, determined that Kepler-102 is like the sun in terms of its composition, but Kepler-407 has more silicon. And silicon is just one element. So what does it matter if a star has a little bit more silicon? Why is that a big deal? Well, if you model the evolution of a planet with a composition that has this much more silicon, you end up with a completely different interior mineralogy, different minerals that are stable within the interior of the planet. So on the left, Kepler-102 is more Earth-like with a mantle rich in a mineral called olivine. And Kepler-407 is more rich in a mineral called garnet. That really small difference could actually have major implications because garnet is stiffer than olivine and therefore is less likely to have long-term plate tectonics be sustainable over geologic timescales. So in order for habitability to occur, or for a planet to be habitable, we also need to know the composition of the planet, and we can deduce that from the composition of the star. There are very few examples of small planet atmospheric detections to date, and they are mostly in the sub-Neptune category, but they already show a little bit of variation. So in this top plot, what you see is a featureless spectrum. It's basically flat. And what this is telling you is that the planet's atmosphere must contain clouds to be consistent with the data. In the bottom plot, they report the detection of water vapor and the likely presence of liquid and icy water clouds in the atmosphere. So how can we learn something, especially about habitability, from these limited observations? What we need is a larger sample set so that we can start to see trends and disentangle different properties. And we can do that by taking a more instrument-driven path. And not only to find exoplanets, but also to determine how many of those planets have atmospheres, and then even more precisely to look at those atmospheres and see what they're made out of. So in particular, Carnegie has unique access to telescopes in Chile, where, for example, the precision radial velocity instrument called the Planet Finder Spectrograph is mounted, PFS. And it's mounted on one of the 2 twin 6.5 meter Magellan telescopes. As an aside, on the neighboring mountain to the Magellans, there's construction has already begun on the 25 meter Giant Magellan telescope. So this is a movie that shows a time lapse, again of Johanna, as well as Jeff Crane and some staff from the observatories, replacing valves and installing an air circulation tube within the Planet Finder Spectrograph, this precision RV instrument. What it does is it helps to, what they're doing is they're installing this circulation tube to better fine tune the temperature control inside the instrument. So what's really cool is that you get a sneak peek inside this instrument. So it turns out that the question of planetary habitability, when looked at from this chemical and physical point of view, is actually quite complicated. So these are not even all the variables that we have to consider in order to know whether or not a planet is habitable. But thankfully, we now have a team to start working through this systematically, and hopefully in the next 5 to 10 years, we can find an answer. But again, it takes more than one scientist to find that answer. So in a few minutes, I'm going to ask some of my colleagues to come onto the screen as a panel to answer your questions. But first, I want to introduce them a bit. We're extremely lucky at Carnegie to have a wide range of expertise on these topics. So first, we have Peter Gao. Peter characterizes the atmospheres of exoplanets through understanding photochemistry, aerosols, and cloud physics. This is an example of his research on the topic. It turns out that when you observe exoplanet atmospheres, you have to worry about clouds and aerosols. And these clouds and aerosols, not only are they common, but they really impact the observations of the light from exoplanets. So it makes it really difficult to get a clear signature from the atmosphere. So Peter and his colleagues determined the aerosol composition on exoplanets as a function of temperature so that it would help in the interpretations of exoplanet observations. Alicia Weinberger observes protoplanetary disks and sometimes catches really strange, crazy events, such as last year when she and colleagues found an extreme flare on Proxima Centauri. Proxima Centauri is about 4 light years away, and it has at least 2 planets, one of which may look a little bit like Earth. And what they caught was that the star went from normal to 14,000 times brighter over the span of a few seconds. And that was because of a solar flare. If there had been life on the planet surrounding the star during this event, it would have had a pretty bad day. George Cody uses a technique called NMR spectroscopy, nuclear magnetic resonance, to identify and trace organic material in meteorites in an effort to understand where organic material comes from. He tracks elemental carbon as it moves through the interstellar medium, through solar system formation, and eventually to the origin of life. George studies this supercritical transition from the chemical to the biological worlds. Peter Driscoll focuses on the magnetic and thermal evolution of planets. He's our magnetic field expert. He has looked at the thermal evolution of the interior, dynamics of the core, atmospheric escape, polarity reversals, surface interior cycling, and internal dynamics of exoplanets. He also makes great movies showing, in this case, the magnetic field inside of the Earth, as well as temperature inside of the Earth. And lastly, Johanna Teske, who observes exoplanets, determines their masses, their radii, their atmospheric composition, and also observes host stars. She's leading a team to measure the densities, architectures, and precise host star abundances of small transiting exoplanets. She's a part of the PFS team at Magellan, and most recently, she is the co-PI of a new James Webb Space Telescope proposal to study the atmospheres of 11 rocky planets that have been identified by TESS. The main goal of her program is to see whether the atmospheres are different depending on the size of the planet, and if they can detect the difference between a primary atmosphere from a secondary atmosphere. As you can see from these Carnegie scientists alone, there's a tremendous range of expertise within our department and within our team. And it will take all of us working together to really get at this question of whether there is life on another planet. So before I open this up to questions, I just want to leave you with one last slide. It's this impression of thousands of planets around other stars that have been discovered throughout our galaxy over a relatively short period of time. In this movie, the planet detections will start popping up as circles, color-coded by the detection method written here. It's a really thrilling time to be a scientist studying planets because based on statistics, we now know that there are likely billions of potentially habitable exoplanets in our galaxy alone. But given the still surprisingly limited knowledge we have of our own habitable planet Earth versus the much larger sample but shallower knowledge we have of exoplanets, how can we start to narrow down where exactly to look for life? And how are we going to know when we find it? Aether hopefully will take critical next steps to explore these questions while building a model of scientific collaboration and community to boost our chances of actually answering them in the near future. So again, what you see here, all the exoplanets as a function of the year in which they were discovered. And these are the Kepler planets. You can see a huge swath right here from the Kepler mission. And that's it. Thank you very much. I'm going to unshare my screen and ask the panelists to pop up. Hello, everyone. Okay, so questions. Where should I start? What do you think about life in the atmosphere of Venus? Peter Gao, I think this is for you.
can take that. And we're starting off with a controversial one, it seems. So I guess this started with the possible detection of phosphine in the clouds, which seems to be not agreeable to the chemistry that we expect in the atmosphere as far as we know. So there's a couple of answers to this. First is that I would say we're not certain that phosphine has indeed been detected. That is still a bit of a controversy in the field. The data has been reduced and analyzed many times, and sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. As to the chemistry that could be happening in the clouds, that is also not well known. And so if phosphine is there, what generates phosphine is not necessarily life. It could be chemistry, especially cloud droplet chemistry, not just gas chemistry, but chemistry happening within the cloud droplets that we don't know about. And so that's definitely something we're looking into right now in trying to answer. So whether it's life, don't know yet. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. I apologize for my dog barking. Okay. Johanna, what about this one? Trappist at 40 light years away is the closest habitable planet. Even if we found perfect conditions on planets further away, would we ever be able to visit them? If so, how?
Yeah, so Trappist, that system is fascinating. It actually has multiple planets in the habitable zone, but it's not actually potentially the closest. The system that Alicia has spent time studying, the Proxima Sun system, actually is the closest stellar system to us, and it is thought that one of the stars in that system also has a habitable planet. There's been evidence of that detected, and with a minimum mass a little bit larger than Earth's mass. And so that is 4 light years away, so better than 40. That's still very far away, but there is actually an initiative called the Starshot project or initiative, which is banking on the idea that laser technology and our ability to send very, very, very small light cameras into space and propel them, that will become possible. And that we wouldn't be able to travel to Proxima Cen B, the planet, but we could potentially send cameras there in a matter of, decades. And so that wouldn't be traveling there, but it would potentially give us a picture of a planet outside of our solar system.
Thank you. Alicia, how could collisions have been ubiquitous given how spread out the solar system is?
Right. Luckily for us, collisions aren't too common right now because we don't want to be done in like the dinosaurs. But one thing that was true of the early solar system is that there were a lot more small bodies like the asteroids and the comets around. And I saw in the chat someone else asked how Jupiter could have moved around. Well, one way Jupiter moved around was by scattering those small bodies out of the solar system, which forced it to move inwards. So there were a lot more of those objects ready to build planets, because you need those objects to build planets bigger, but also to smack into the planets after they were formed. Now, some of those impacts could be useful. They could bring water, they could bring carbonaceous molecules, but some of them could be quite destructive. They could melt the entire surface of the Earth.
You. George, we have 2 questions that I think come to you. One is about the origin of water on Earth. There is a debate about the origin of water on Earth, some saying it came from far off frozen water bodies, and some arguing that water was part of Earth from its formation time. So even if a planet is in the correct distance from its star, has a gaseous atmosphere, has plate tectonics, where do you think the water would come from?
That's a great question, because we're really actively working on that right now. The questioner is absolutely right. There are these questions. It turns out that depending on how you make a planet, if you make a molten planet, silicate melts tend to be very affable for water incorporation, and therefore it would be very difficult to pull the water out of the melt before it crystallized. So So one school of thought says that you should be able to retain the water. Then another school of thought says, well, it's so hot and so hot, that you're going to lose all the water. So you're going to have to bring it in through cometary impacts later. And the simple fact of the matter is this is a study in question. And that's really all I can say about it. It's one of the things we're studying.
Thank you, George. Peter Driscoll. Atmospheric conditions can be remotely detected using spectroscopy, but is estimating bulk density the only way to infer that magnetic fields of exoplanets exist?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it's hard to learn anything about the interiors of planets, even our own. And it turns out that planetary magnetic fields emit radio waves that can be detected remotely if the solar wind is sending enough electrons to the planet, and those electrons get trapped on the magnetic field. They start spinning and they emit essentially radio waves. And this is how we detected Jupiter's magnetic field. And there's proposals to build large space-based radio telescopes to look for exoplanet magnetic fields. But that's in the future. But so there is some potential there.
Thanks, Peter. Johanna, this is an interesting question. If you could choose one existing instrument and make it an order of magnitude more accurate or sensitive in order to advance your work, which one would it be and why?
Yes, I helped write a whole report on this, basically. It was jointly convened by NASA and the NSF, and it was called, it's a report on extreme precision radial velocity. And so, as Anat mentioned, right now, we don't really have the technological capabilities to be able to detect the Earth's radial velocity signal around the sun. And we need something like an order of magnitude improvement in precision to be even have the hope of doing that. And so that's what people are working on right now to try to do. And it's important not just for detecting that type of planet around another sun, but finding good candidates that then we can use kind of next generation NASA missions to then take pictures of. And so there's really a connection between these ground-based observations, finding the small Earth-like planets, and then space-based instrumentation being able to take pictures of them and characterize them and see how close they are to the Earth in composition.
Thanks, Johanna. Okay, how about another instrument question? If you could fill a gap in the suite of instruments you have to collect data for Aether, what would you really like to add? Alicia, how about you?
Well, I guess I have to advertise another talk that I'm giving on Thursday now. So Thursday afternoon, if you want to come to my virtual conversation, I'm going to talk about an instrument I'm trying to build for our telescopes that will really do more than an order of magnitude better in measuring the gaseous composition of exoplanet atmospheres and the gaseous composition of disks out of which exoplanets are forming. So I'm super excited about the possibilities for learning a lot more about planet formation and exoplanet atmospheres with that instrument. We can build it soon.
Thanks, Alicia. Peter Gao, what about this question? Based on what we know today, where does Mars fit in your models for habitability, and what actually happened to it?
Yeah, so Mars is an interesting case. It might be a planet that is just too small. So we have evidence that perhaps billions of years ago it had running water and perhaps even gigantic floods and lakes. That's what the rovers that are currently on there, they're trying to look for. But because Mars is small, has lower gravity, it might have lost a lot of its atmosphere. And once you lose your atmosphere, you essentially run out of habitable space. And so one of the ideas is that's probably what happened. It lost its atmosphere. The surface now has much lower pressure, much lower temperature than what is considered habitable. And unfortunately, it just got to be that way. Yeah.
Thanks, Peter. George, how about a question about anaerobic respiration? Would there be any difference in atmospheric composition if the main microbes used anaerobic respiration, or is oxygen the only way complex life could evolve? Oh, you're muted. Hold on. Yeah.
Sorry. That's a multi-level question. So let's take apart. So complex life does require oxygen. We don't have a solution beyond using oxygen for complex life because of the energetic requirements. Anaerobic life, it's hard to imagine an oxidant that would substitute for oxygen. And Peter Gao would have a better guess about what that might be. But it really comes down to thermodynamics. In fact, life is all about thermodynamics. So if it's thermodynamically possible to do a reaction that you need to do, then it will happen biologically. That's sort of a state, that's the kind of the law of biology. And for complex life, the law requires a very strong oxygen coupling to reductants, fuels. That's what we have on Earth. So you would have to ask the question to not me, but Peter Gao, and say, well, is it possible that an atmosphere could produce an alternate hyperoxidant, because oxygen is one of the strongest oxidants there is, to basically allow for you to migrate from single-cell organisms to multi-cell organisms? And I would hand that off to Peter, because that's all I know about it.
Unfortunately, I can't really add much to it because I also cannot think of a more oxidizing thing. And so I guess that's all I can say about that. Sorry.
Likewise.
Yeah.
Okay, more questions. Alicia, it was just announced that scientists have discovered their first planet outside of our Milky Way. How would we be able to detect any characteristics of life so far away?
Yeah, that would be really hard. So the great thing is that physics is the same everywhere in the universe. So when we find the Milky Way is full of exoplanets, we definitely expect the same will be true of other similar galaxies. We are really looking for biosignatures or even understanding what a planet's characteristics are. We're interested in the planets around the closest stars because those are the brightest things that we have to look at. And it's going to be hard enough to detect biosignatures around nearby planets whose masses we know and whose sizes we know, then going to planets that are really far away, even in our galaxy, much less other galaxies, to things that we know much less about. So the good news is our galaxy is full of exoplanets and we have plenty to work on. And the good news is that our expectation that all galaxies should form stars and planets in a similar way also seems to be confirmed by the discovery of this possible exoplanet in another nearby galaxy. I will say that planet is in a really different system. If it's really a planet, it's in a really different system than a normal stellar system like ours. There's a neutron star or black hole, for example, in that system. There's a massive stellar companion, much more massive than the sun. So it's unlike the systems that we're generally looking at for exoplanets nearby. And those things probably exist in our galaxy if they exist in the Whirlpool galaxy. So it just also goes to show how much fun astronomy is because there are always new things to discover.
Can I also add something to that? So this topic of extragalactic planets, while yes, physics operates universally, what might be different in different galaxies is the chemistry of the stars. I mean, even the stars in the Milky Way have different compositions of chemistries, and Anat talked about how that might influence the compositions of planets. And so in particular, if there are planets that are forming in galaxies that on average just have a lot less silicon or magnesium or iron, then the typical planet in those galaxies might be different than the typical planet in our galaxy. And there's actually stars in the Milky Way that you can identify based on their motion and their composition that appear to be sort of interlopers that probably formed in another galaxy, but now are in our galaxy. And so searching for planets around these like interloping stars might be a way to find planets that formed outside the Milky Way, but are now close enough to be better characterized. So that's something I'm interested in doing.
Thank you. So there are like 4 or 5 questions that all basically ask the same thing, which is, what is the definition for life? Are there other chemistries we can use for life? So George, I'll ask you if you can answer that. It's a hard question.
So the simple answer is, of course, I can't, right? But what we can say about life is what we know about life. And life is a very interesting system that finds a way of basically taking available energy from the environment. So it's a connection with the planetary environment, either as photo energy or as geological energy, and it converts it into creating itself. So what you're really asking is, what is the origin of life, or what the definition of life is? It is a system that is out of equilibrium completely, that is converting energy into creating itself. And that's really the only definition. And I know that's not a very satisfying definition, but that is really the only definition there is, as far as we know, because that is in fact what life is. So I don't know what more I could say about it other than that. So it factors into the Greater Aether project. Of course, I mean, in all cases, we have stars that are generating huge amounts of solar radiation, and 99.9% of life on this planet is driven by solar radiation. So, that tells you that much. If you took the solar radiation out of the question, less than 0.01% or maybe 1% of life could be sustained by just what we call dark energy, from just the thermal energy emitted from the planet itself. But at the end of the day, life is something that couples to an energy source, and through mysterious ways that we're still working on, enables the consumption of energy in a very efficient way to recreate itself and to propagate to the extent to which the energy is available to it. I think that's the best. That's all I can say.
Thanks, George. Let's do one more quick question because I'm noticing the time. And for those of you whose questions we haven't answered yet, please feel free to email us. You can email me and I can send it to the right person, or I'll try to answer it because we can't get to all the questions. But here's a quick one for you, Peter Driscoll. Why would Mars' core be less dense and larger in relation to its size compared to Earth's core?
So so Mars, we think Mars has more sulfur than the Earth, and so its core likely has sulfur rich, which would make it less dense than the Earth's. It's actually, the core is less of a mass fraction of the whole planet than the Earth. It's about 24%. But that's not to say it couldn't have had a magnetic field. We think it did have a magnetic field and then it died. And that's one of the big outstanding questions in Mars history that people are trying to figure out.
Thank you. Thank you all very much for answering questions. It was great. And thank you to the audience for asking questions. And Rick, I will send it back to you.
Thank you, Anat, for assembling this team to address this really interesting and obviously quite difficult problem. But the advances that we made in this in just the last few years is really stunning, and this has such promise. Before we all go, I'll make one more plug for Alicia Weinberger's upcoming talk on Thursday. It's at Thursday at 3 p.m. You can find it on our webpage at EPL and get the link from there to join us on Thursday. So thank you all for your attendance. It's great to see you virtually. I wish you could all be here, and hopefully by next year we'll be able to return to our in-person neighborhood lectures on the beautiful Carnegie campus. So good night, everyone.